Tip number 1 is to know your level and to set realistic goals. The requirements for a 6 and a 9 are completely different. If you're aiming for a 6, then it's better to give short, simple, clear answers and to avoid unnecessary risk. If you're aiming for a higher score, like a 7.5 or above, then your answers might need to be a bit more ambitious. You might need to use slightly more complicated grammatical structures or perhaps some more advanced vocabulary. Think of it like lifting weights. When you go to the gym, you don't just pick up the biggest, heaviest weights you can find and start lifting them. You find weights that are manageable for you based on your size, strength, and fitness goals, and you start from there. IELTS is exactly the same. Whatever score you're going for, it's important to avoid making too many mistakes. And so it's important to adjust your answers according to your level and to the score that you're aiming for. If you try to speak at a level that is too high for you, then you're probably going to make a lot of mistakes. However, if you're a more advanced student and you're aiming for a higher score, giving answers that are too simple or too cautious is probably going to result in you not getting the score that you want. So, choose the right answer for you and your level. Let's look at some example answers. Question: are you a student or do you work? Simple answer: I am a student. I study engineering at Shanghai University. I love learning about engineering. Advanced answer: I'm currently an engineering student at Shanghai University studying for my master's degree. I've always been fascinated by everything related to engineering, so to be able to study it at such a prestigious university is a dream come true. I've never had a job before, but I'm really looking forward to starting work once I graduate. Can you see how the simple answer would be inappropriate for an advanced student and the advanced answer would be inappropriate for a student at a lower level? Know your level. Tip number 2 is to focus on what really matters. During the exam, so many students get distracted by things that don't really matter, such as being interesting, truthful, or even correct in their statements. The things you say don't have to be true, they don't have to be interesting, and they don't even necessarily have to be factually correct. For example, let's imagine I'm taking the exam and I've been asked the question, what do you eat for breakfast? I could tell the truth here, but the truth is kind of complicated, so maybe it would be easier if I just made something up. Let's look at what the truthful answer might be. I don't really eat breakfast. Well, I suppose maybe I do, but it's later on. I don't eat then. I eat after. It's lunch. There's a name for it. I can't remember the word. Sorry. I eat breakfast, but it's not breakfast. I wait. Sorry, I don't know the word. Is it fasting? Okay, maybe I fast sometimes until lunch or something like that, I think. Sorry. So, in that answer, I tried to tell the truth, but the truth was difficult to explain. So, let's have a look at an answer that's less truthful and a bit more simple. I usually eat a very large breakfast. I try to eat healthy foods every day, so for breakfast I eat a lot of fruits and vegetables, but sometimes I might also have some bacon or a fried egg if I'm really hungry. Do you see how the second answer was much easier? In the truthful answer, I got stuck looking for words I couldn't remember, like fasting and brunch. Whereas in the second answer, I was free to say anything. All I had to do was name a few foods. If I forgot the word bacon, I could have simply said sausages. If I forgot the word sausages, I could have just said bread. It wouldn't have mattered because none of it is true. I could just make up anything and say whatever I want. Of course, for some people, lying is difficult, or they prefer not to do it. in which case you can tell the truth. That's fine. All I'm saying is that you don't have to tell the truth, and sometimes it's easier to not tell the truth. But the most important thing is to do whatever makes it easier for you to get the score that you want. Similarly, your answers also don't have to be interesting. Some people feel like they have to express really interesting thoughts or opinions, and so they put pressure on themselves to come up with complex ideas and opinions and then struggle to explain them. But remember, this is not necessary. You can be as boring as you like. You do not lose points for being boring. It's fine. And finally, remember that the things you say don't actually always have to be factually correct. Let's say you're answering the part 3 question, which is noisier, the city or the countryside? We all know the answer, right? The city is, of course, much noisier. But does that mean that you have to say that the city is noisier? No. You're free to say whatever you want. So if you're from the countryside and you find it easier to talk about the noise in the countryside, then you can say the countryside is noisier. You could give the examples of barking dogs, loud agricultural equipment, vehicles passing by in the night, or birds squawking in the morning. Maybe you think the people are louder in the countryside too. It's completely subjective. It's your opinion. As long as you express it well, you can say whatever you want. However, there is one important thing to note here. In some cases, giving an incorrect answer could be perceived as you lacking the correct vocabulary. For example, if I refer to the River Thames in London as a lake, that could be because I have a poor knowledge of geography, but it also could be because I don't know the difference between the words river and lake in English. So make sure to avoid creating this kind of misunderstanding. Be clear about what you mean to say. So remember, you are not being graded on being truthful. You are not being graded on how interesting you are. You are not being graded on your knowledge of science, geography, mathematics, or anything like that. You are simply being graded on your ability to communicate in English. Focus on that. Tip number 3, prepare relevant vocabulary. It's important to have all the vocabulary that you need in order to answer the questions. Forgetting an important word can turn a potentially great answer into a bad one. Have a look at every topic and think about what you might say and what things you might talk about. Do you have all the vocabulary you need? Write down some key words next to each topic. They don't have to be really advanced or impressive words. They simply have to be useful words for the exam. Any word that you are likely to need in the exam, make sure you know how to use it. For example, if the topic is studying, it's probably important for me to know the following words: classmate, professor, revision, project. But it's not just important to know the words, it's important to know how to use them as well. For example, revision is a noun, but what's the verb form? Revise. And the past tense? Revised. How can I use this in a sentence? I spent a long time revising for the exam. For each topic, write down at least 3 or 4 words that you might need, or words that you think that you are likely to forget or have trouble with. Make sure you are completely comfortable with these words and all their different forms. Again, these words should be relative to your level. If you're an advanced student, you might want to write down some more advanced words. If you're at a lower level, then the words you will need to remember will probably be simpler words. Tip number 4. Remember that IELTS and English are not the same thing. Of course, the IELTS exam is an English exam, but IELTS and English are still 2 different skills. You can be good at IELTS, but bad at English, And you can be good at English, but bad at IELTS, or hopefully good at both. Some people have great English, but do badly in the exam because they don't have the right strategy. Other people understand the IELTS exam very well and know how to approach it strategically, but simply don't have the required level of English needed to pass. It's useful to remember that IELTS and English are two different but interconnected skills. If you've studied the exam thoroughly and understand the requirements and grading criteria, but still can't get the score that you need, it's very likely that you need to work more on your English skills. This can take time and is more of a long-term process. If your English is usually great, but you can't pass the exam, it could be that your exam strategy is not good enough. The amount of time you have available is also a factor. If your exam is tomorrow, then you have very little time to improve your English, and therefore your efforts might be better spent on specifically practicing the exam questions and figuring out methods to help you display the best possible version of your English during the exam. However, if your exam is a few months away, then you should probably focus as much as possible on the fundamentals of the English language and make sure you're as fluent as possible. It takes years to learn English, but it can take only days, weeks, or months to fully understand the IELTS exam. For most people, the best strategy is a combination of the two. Study the IELTS questions and use this as an opportunity to find areas in which your level of English needs to improve. Tip number 5, targeted study. 1 hour of effective targeted study is better than 10 hours of aimless, generalized study. If your vocabulary is good, but your grammar is bad, then spending lots of time focusing on growing your vocabulary probably won't help you much. If your pronunciation is fantastic, but your fluency is bad, then you probably don't need to focus on your pronunciation. You need to work on improving your fluency. And when it comes to grammatical errors, we have to be even more specific. In casual conversation, it's quite possible to get by with a fairly basic or even flawed understanding of English grammar. You can use the wrong tenses and people will still understand most of what you're saying. This is how people are able to communicate when they go on holiday to a foreign country and they aren't fluent in the language. However, in the exam, it's important to display good grammatical understanding and proficiency. It doesn't matter if the examiner understands what you're saying, they have to see that you're able to say it correctly. Through practice, preferably with a teacher, find out what things you struggle with or don't understand. Do you find it difficult to tell stories? Is present perfect confusing to you? Do you struggle with using the correct pronouns? Do you struggle to know when to use present simple and when to use present continuous? What is causing you to make the most errors? Once you've established where it is you need to improve or what it is that you're struggling to understand, study it until you understand it. Research it online, ask a teacher to explain it to you, practice creating your own examples, read about it in books, do whatever it is you need to do to be confident in using this particular grammatical device or feature. Find the weaknesses in your speaking and start with those. When you have improved in those areas, look for other areas you need to improve in. Be consistent about this and you will make great improvements. Now I'm going to give you some tips that are specific to part 1. So, in part 1, know the basics. It's important to be ready for any part 1 questions, but the basic introductory questions are the most important ones because they are the ones that appear the most frequently. You don't need to prepare scripted, pre-prepared answers for these questions, but it's good to have a very clear idea of what you will talk about. When the examiner asks you, do you live in a house or an apartment? You don't want to get stuck deciding whether to talk about your student dormitory or your parents' house that you spend half the year in or the place that you live in on the weekends. You want to know what to say. When the examiner asks, "Are you a student or do you work?" you don't want to get stuck deciding whether to talk about your part-time job or the online course that you're currently enrolled in, or when you'll go back to university in 2 months. You want to know what you will say. When the examiner asks, "What is your hometown?" you don't want to waste time worrying about whether you should talk about the town you grew up in or the town you were born in and only lived in for 2 years. You should already know what you will talk about when the examiner asks you these questions. These questions, these introductory questions, are almost guaranteed to be in the exam, so you should be fully prepared for them. Another part 1 tip, scale your answers. Generally speaking, a part 1 answer should be between 2 and 3 sentences. Earlier in the video, I mentioned the importance of knowing your level and forming your answers according to your level. For a lower score, like a 6, it's generally sensible to avoid risks by giving slightly shorter answers, maybe closer to 2 sentences. And for a higher score, like a 7.5 or above, you are likely to need to tend towards slightly longer answers, closer to 3 sentences, maybe with a bit more detail. However, it's good to also scale your answers based on the difficulty of the question. If a particular question is difficult and you are not confident in answering it well, giving a more basic answer can be a good way of avoiding errors and moving on quickly to the next question. However, when you're asked a question that you feel more confident about answering, it can be a good idea to try and be a bit more expressive. Scale your answers depending on the score you want and also on the difficulty of the question. Another tip for part 1, take your answers step by step. When asked a simple question, like, "Do you live in a house or an apartment?" you could give an equally simple answer like, "I live in a house," but you would not score many points for this answer. So, you could give a slightly longer, more detailed answer like, "I live in a 4-bedroom house with my parents." But why stop there? It's an easy question, so why not add a bit more to your answer? For example, "I live in a beautiful 4-bedroom house with my parents and our pet dog. The house has a big garden and lots of space. It's a really nice place to relax, and I always feel so comfortable there." Can you see how we've easily added a few extra details? You don't have to be too ambitious. You don't have to speak in long, complicated sentences or use really advanced vocabulary. Instead, you can build answers step by step, never doing more than what is comfortable or achievable. Let's look at another example. Do you prefer to use a pen or a pencil? I could say, I prefer pencils, but a better, more detailed answer would be, I prefer to use pencils. I love writing with them and I always use them at work. I also enjoy using them at home and I have a large collection of them on my desk. I like to use all different kinds of pencils. Both of these answers show a fairly limited range of grammar. Neither of them are extremely advanced or require exceptional English skills, and both are actually reflective of a similar level of spoken English. And yet, the first one is unnecessarily short and is unlikely to earn many points, whereas answers like the second one will result in a much higher score. So, I'm now going to give some tips for part 2. So, part 2, start strong. The number one most common issue I see when practicing part 2 with my students is that after giving them the 1 minute of preparation time, I ask them to start speaking and they immediately freeze and don't know what to say. I say, "Okay, your 2 minutes to speak starts now." And I wait. 10 seconds goes by, sometimes even 20 seconds goes by. The student is stuck. They don't know how to begin. And then, by the time the 2 minutes end, they either haven't had time to answer the question or they've barely provided any detail. This situation is easily avoidable. Always plan how you are going to start your part 2 answers, and this will put you on the right track and give you the confidence and time needed to finish your answer. Otherwise, you'll feel panicked, rushed, and unsure of yourself. Practice your part 2 introductions. Just like with part 1, part 2 answers and their introductions can be scaled accordingly. For lower level students aiming for a score of a 6, sometimes it can be easier and safer to take a simple option, even using the question itself to form the introduction. For example, let's look at a question. Talk about a bad holiday experience you had recently. You should say where you went, who you went there with, when you went there, and why it was bad. So, for this question, you could introduce your answer by using the question itself as a basis. The question says, talk about a bad holiday experience you had recently. So to introduce the question, you could say, I am going to talk about a bad holiday experience I had recently. This is an acceptable introduction, but it is quite basic and not ideal for a student aiming for a higher score. It's better than nothing, and it's better than getting stuck. However, if you want to achieve a higher score, then it's better to give a more original introduction that shows less reliance on the question. For example, last year I went on holiday to Japan with my parents and it was an absolute disaster. Here, we have avoided repetition of the question and we have avoided unnecessary explainers like, I am going to talk about. And we have shown the ability to tell stories that are more nuanced and engaging. We don't really need to say, I am going to talk about this, I am going to talk about that. We can just begin talking about it. Last year, I went on holiday to Japan with my parents, and it was an absolute disaster. Great introduction to a story. Another part 2 tip, notes. The most valuable resource you have in part 2 is the pen, paper, and 1 minute of preparation time. For some reason, many students completely fail to take advantage of these assets. Using the pen and paper and your 1 minute of preparation time can help you structure your answer, prepare your introduction, and also make note of any key areas of difficulty in the question or vocabulary that you might need. There is no one single correct way to take notes, but it's definitely important to have a reliable system that works for you, which you can use for any questions that come up in part 2. Having a system means you don't have to think about what to do, you can just do it. Develop a system and make use of your notes. If you'd like more information about how to structure your notes in the IELTS exam, then check out my book at the link in the description. It's available as an ebook and a paper book, and it contains a more detailed guide giving you various different examples of how you can structure your notes in part 2 to give the best possible answer. Okay, so on to part 3. My first tip for part 3 is flexibility. The first and most important skill in part 3 is flexibility. Not physical flexibility, you don't need to be able to do this, but mental flexibility. You need to be ready to talk about anything. The key word here is anything. It doesn't really matter much what you talk about or what you say, as long as it's relevant to the question and you express it well. Some students struggle to come up with ideas, and so if this is a problem you have, it's a good idea to practice this skill specifically. Let's look at an example question. Why should children be taught to help others? Sometimes students completely freeze when asked this question. They don't know what the correct answer is. There is no correct answer. You can say whatever you want here, as long as you show that you've clearly understood the question. If you have trouble coming up with ideas, take some time by yourself to try and come up with a list of 10 possible answers to this question. You don't have to do this practice exercise in English. You can even do it in your own language if that's easier. The purpose of the exercise is just to practice coming up with ideas. This will improve the flexibility of your mind. Here's 10 ideas you could use to answer the question, why should children be taught to help others? 1. It's the right thing to do morally. 2. It will make them more popular with other students. 3. It will impress their teachers. 4. It will help them learn social skills. 5. Other people might be more likely to help them in the future. 6. It will help them learn professional skills. 7. It will set a good example for others. 8. It will make their parents look good. 9. It will make the world a better place to live. 10. It will make them happy. So those are 10 possible reasons, 10 different things that I could talk about in the exam. Some of them are not very convincing arguments, and some of them are. Some of them are boring, some are true, some probably aren't. But it doesn't matter. What's important is that you have something relevant to talk about. And remember, you don't need all 10 of those answers. Just pick a few of them and talk about those. 2 or 3 is usually enough. You could even just talk about 1 and talk about it in detail. But practicing and coming up with a list of 10 will improve your mental flexibility. My next tip for part 3 is yes and no. Another way to be more flexible in answering part 3 questions is to use what I call the yes and no method. Here's an example question. Should all tourist attractions be free to the public? You could answer this question by saying yes and then explaining why. You could answer this question by saying no and then explaining why. Or you could choose to say both yes and no, which will give you more things to talk about. Here's how to do this. Well, on the one hand, I think that tourist attractions should be free to the public because this would encourage people to see them more. Some people can't afford to pay to see expensive tourist attractions, and this might deter them from going. Making tourist attractions free will also help bring more tourists to the country, and that will benefit the economy. What's more, these tourist attractions can often provide a valuable educational experience for children, and I think that education for children should always be free. On the other hand, if tourist attractions cost money to visit, then they will generate money that can be reinvested to make the tourist attractions even better. This might lead to a better experience for everyone. Also, if the tourist attractions are free, then they will be paid for by taxpayers, which means that taxpayers will have to pay for something that tourists enjoy for free, which might not be fair on the local residents. In conclusion, it's a difficult question to answer, but if I had to choose an answer, I would say yes. Tourist attractions should probably be free to the public. So, by choosing to answer both yes and no, by saying on the one hand, but on the other hand, I was able to come up with more reasons and give a longer, more complete and structured answer. This is a helpful strategy if you're struggling to come up with detailed enough answers. If just saying yes is too difficult, you can't provide enough detail, or just saying no is not giving you enough to talk about, try saying yes and no. So the next tip, I don't know what number this is. I've lost count and I don't have enough fingers to keep counting. But the next tip is FOFPEPCH. You might be wondering, what is FOFPEPCH? Is this a word I don't know? Is this a new concept? FOFPEPCH is an acronym I came up with. It stands for facts, opinions, feelings, personal experiences, examples, predictions, comparisons, and hypotheticals. These are all different things you can talk about when you can't think of anything to say. Let's have an example question. This one is from part 3. Is public transportation important? Fact. In big cities, almost everybody uses public transport because there is a lot of traffic and it's usually quicker and cheaper to take the subway or bus. Most big cities have subways. Opinion. I think public transport is a really important and valuable thing. If we didn't have it, it would be hard to get to work on time. Feeling. I hope that public transport continues to be an important part of city life, and I hope that people understand how important it is. I really enjoy being on the subway. Personal experience. I grew up in a small town where there was limited public transport. It was very hard to do anything. Example. Switzerland is known for having great public transport, and this is one of the reasons lots of people want to live and work there. Prediction. In the future, public transport will become even more important because more and more people will move to big cities. Comparison. When I was younger, the public transport was not very good and it was hard to get to work on time, whereas nowadays it's very efficient and it's much easier to get to work. Hypothetical. If my city didn't have public transport, it would be a disaster. Nobody would be able to get to work on time. So, there was an example of how we can use FOFPEPCH to create answers when we're not sure what to say. Of course, you don't need to say all of those things. You just need one or two. But remembering this acronym, FOFPEPCH, can really help when you're struggling to think of something to say. You don't have to remember it as FOFPEPCH. You can just think feelings, opinions, facts, personal experiences, examples, predictions, comparisons, hypotheticals. Or you can just think of one or two of those and it might help you to come up with something when you're stuck. Okay, tip number, whatever number this is, choose the right date. This is very important. The IELTS questions typically change in January, May and September. This occasionally differs in certain countries, but generally speaking, this is when they change. With this in mind, you should try to choose a date that gives you plenty of time to practice the updated batch of questions. For example, if you book your exam for the 1st of January, you will have had absolutely no time to practice the new questions. Whereas, if you choose the last day of April, you will have had 4 months to practice that batch of questions. However, you must also consider the fact that you might not pass on the first attempt, and so it could be wise to leave some extra time for you to book another exam if necessary. With all this in mind, a good date to book your exam for might be 2 to 3 weeks before the questions change, but all of this depends on your personal standards, expectations and preferences. Take all the factors into consideration and choose the right date for you. Also, because the exam can be so nerve-wracking, I often recommend that students consider the first one a kind of practice exam. This helps you get some exam practice and become comfortable with it without the added pressure of needing to get a good grade. If you have the time and money, then planning to book 2 or more exams can be a good idea. If you get the grade you want in the first one, then great, you won't need to do another one. But if you don't get the grade you want, then it's no problem because you can just consider it a practice exam. The next tip is practice in exam conditions. A lot of students practice for the exam in conditions that are totally different to the conditions of the actual exam. Whilst this is still useful, it's better to make your practice as realistic as possible. For example, some students use their phone or their computer to take notes during Part 2 practice. You won't be able to use your phone in the exam, so practice using a pen and paper. Some students don't time themselves during Part 2 practice, but you will be timed in the exam, so use a timer and time yourself. Make it as much like the exam as possible. Some students also use translation apps to check words while they're practicing. You can't do that in the exam either. What will you do in the exam if you forget a word? You need to practice these situations because they will probably happen during the exam. When practicing, it's okay to check a word after you've finished answering the question, but not before. Answer the question to the best of your ability. Improvise if you can't remember a word. Think of another word. Find another way to answer the question, and then afterwards you can look up the word. This will teach your brain to improvise. It will teach your brain to complete the answers even when you're not sure of the word you're looking for, and then you can learn the word afterwards. The more similar your practice is to the exam, the less nervous you will feel during the exam. Learn useful phrases for communicating with the examiner. Prior to the exam, you might be expected to engage in what we call small talk with the examiner. Small talk is a term for general, polite conversation we make with strangers, usually about unimportant or casual topics. The examiner might say things like, "How are you? Nice to meet you," or "Take a seat over here." Try to be ready for this kind of conversation and have some idea of what you might say. For example, "I'm fine, thank you. How are you?" Or May I sit here? Or is it okay if I put my bag down over here? You won't be graded on this section. It's not part of your score, but it's still quite important, as having a positive interaction with the examiner will improve your confidence before the exam and also give a good first impression. Think about what might happen when you get to the exam and practice useful phrases for this situation. You will feel much better if you have a positive, friendly interaction with the examiner before your exam. Similarly, there might be some moments during the exam when you need to ask the examiner a question. For example, could you repeat the question, please? Or, I still can't understand the question. Could you repeat it more slowly, please? Or, I didn't hear that last word. Did you say car or card? Or, okay, thank you for clarifying. These are just a few examples of phrases you might need. Think about what you might need to say to the examiner before, during, or after the exam and prepare for it. The next tip is to remember that everyone gets nervous. Almost everyone, unless they're superhuman, gets nervous when they do the IELTS exam. For most people, getting a good score in the exam is really important. It can be your way of getting into a good university, getting a new job, or starting a new life overseas. It's completely normal to be nervous and almost impossible to avoid. However, being nervous does not mean you won't pass the exam. You can be nervous and still do really well. Try your best to relax before the exam, but if you can't, then don't worry about it. As long as you've prepared well, then you'll probably still do great. Just make sure to stay focused. If you give a bad answer or you don't understand a question, don't dwell on it. Just move on to the next question. Everyone makes mistakes in the exam, and giving one bad answer is not going to ruin your whole score. But obsessing over it and thinking about it too much might. So just keep moving forwards, do your best, and remember that if you've worked hard to prepare, then you deserve to do well. Good luck. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to book classes with me, you can do so at the link in the description, subject to availability. Also, if you'd like to check out my book on the IELTS speaking exam, then you can find that at the link in the description. It's a very short, simple, easy to read book. It contains all the tips from this video, plus some other tips not discussed in the video. For example, a great note-taking strategy for part 2, and some more helpful, more detailed strategies for part 3. It's available very cheaply as a paperbook or ebook, short, simple, and easy to read, and it might just be the difference in helping you get the score that you need. So check that out, and thanks for watching.